Welcome to part two of A Christmas Most Unusual. This is a little short story that I wrote a year ago that I intended to get out on audio for Christmas 2024, and I didn't make it. I was writing books instead. I think I put out 5 books this year, which kept me relatively busy, 5 100,000 word books. So I thought I would just do this instead and give a link to everybody that wants it, and then you can hear the story for yourself if you don't like to actually read an ebook or a paperback. This story is available as part of a collection, by the way, one of a whole bunch of short stories around the holidays that I published a year ago called Middle Falls Holidays. So that is available as an ebook and a paperback as well. Okay, let's get on with the story here. When last we left, Katie and Isaac had just introduced themselves. I'll read just a paragraph of where I left off before. I'm Katie, by the way. So when your housekeeper comes back and wants to know who's been mucking around in her kitchen, you can tell her it was me. I'm Isaac. He bent down and patted Mushu's head. Now we all know each other. He noticed that Mushu sat quietly, purposefully not begging for anything. He took a saucer down and poured some milk into it, then set it on the floor. He scooted around Katie, who was still heating the milk on the stove, and opened the refrigerator. He took the leftover meatloaf out, sliced several pieces, then put one on another saucer and set it in front of Mushu, who gave a quiet woof of thanks. Isaac hesitated, then said, "Would you like a meatloaf sandwich? I know it doesn't pair very well with hot chocolate, but..." Katie kept her back turned to Isaac. She stirred the warming milk, but the rest of her was very still. He got the idea she was fighting something within herself. After 10 seconds, she turned and said, "That would be very nice, thank you." While Katie finished making their hot chocolate, Isaac made them both meatloaf sandwiches. It was an odd scene in a kitchen that rarely saw anything other than sedate domesticity. A dog happily lapping milk and nibbling at meatloaf where no dog had ever been before. A stranger sitting at the table, an equally unlikely sight. The phone rang, and Isaac jumped up to answer the wall phone. "Hello?" A moment later, he said, "Baby and mother are doing well?" Then, "Good, good. Does she look like you?" He chuckled at whatever the answer was, then hung up the phone. He sat back at the table and said, "Unto us a child is born." Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, Katie said absently. "Oh, is that a biblical verse? It's just one of those sayings that lodges in my head. I never know where it comes from." Katie closed her eyes and said, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. And the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." Poor kid, born on Christmas. For the best of his life, he'll get presents, and people will say, "This is for Christmas and your birthday." He looked more carefully at Katie and said, "Can you do that with any Bible verse?" She shrugged. "No, not all of them. I'm a preacher's kid, though. When you spend as many hours in a pew as I did, some of it's going to stick." Isaac longed to know how she had made the trip from pew to homeless in Middle Falls on this Christmas, but he knew it was none of his business. Still, he couldn't keep all his curiosity to himself. "I see you're limping." He let the statement hang there in the air. "I have a bit of a wound on my foot, that's all. It'll heal soon enough." "I was a medic in the army a few decades back. I can take a look at it if you'd like." Katie just shook her head. "Well, you let me know if you change your mind. If it gets infected, a small wound can become a big problem." Mushu had licked the saucers clean of both milk and meatloaf and laid beside them, her head resting on her paws, looking at Katie. Katie likewise drained her hot chocolate and finished her sandwich. "Thank you. This has been lovely, but we should be getting back." She picked the dishes and cups up and took them to the sink. Isaac wanted to keep them from going on, both for their sake and for his. He couldn't think of a thing to say to stop them, however. Instead, he stood there helplessly while Katie put her dirty sweatshirt and coat on and headed for the front door. Katie and Mushu stepped out onto the porch, and Isaac lingered in the open door, still wanting them to stay for at least a bit longer, but not wanting to impose. Katie stepped down onto the lawn. Isaac noticed that she made footprints in the snow now and reached for the Christmas tree leaning against the porch. With no warning, Mushu took off like a shot. She ran to the sidewalk, turned left, and ran half a block ahead. She turned around and looked in the direction of Katie and Isaac as if to say, "Aren't you coming?" "Mushu," Katie yelled. "Come on, girl. That's the wrong direction." Mushu looked at Kate, then turned and looked the other way. It was apparent the little dog didn't think she was heading in the wrong direction. "Mushu," Katie said, a note of exasperation sneaking into her voice for the first time. She looked up at Isaac and said, "She hasn't acted like this before. She's always stayed right with me." "Do you have a leash for her?" "No, I've never needed one." "I don't have one either," Isaac said. "Never had a dog." He paused and said, "Let me slip my shoes and coat on. I'll help you get her." He closed the door and was only gone for a few seconds, then reappeared dressed for the weather. "Let's leave your tree here for the moment. You can retrieve it on the way back through." Katie looked a little puzzled, as though she wasn't quite sure how Isaac had injected himself into the situation. She couldn't find a reason to say no without being rude, though, so she shrugged, and the two of them set off after Mushu. For her part, Mushu barked happily as they approached. Before they got too close, she turned and scampered away again. She never went too far ahead, but always moved 40 or 50 yards ahead, then lingered, waiting for them. "We could end up in Portland at this rate," Isaac observed. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched Katie walk and noticed that her limp was becoming more pronounced. He clapped his hands and in his friendliest voice said, "Come on, Mushu. Come on, Pooch. Let's go home. I've got some more meatloaf you can have in a doggy bag." Mushu grinned and panted at him, but showed no interest in turning around. They continued this way for quite some time until Isaac realized they had entered into the neighborhood of smaller, poorer houses called Crampton Village. This area often looks somewhat disreputable, but a fresh layer of snow makes everything look better. "I don't know what to do," Katie said. "We're getting farther and farther away from where I'm going." Isaac paused, considering the situation. "When we go back to pick up your tree, please come inside and let me have a look at your foot. That will make everything easier for you." Katie took a deep breath, but finally nodded her assent, which likely showed just how much pain she was in. Just ahead, an older woman was bundled up against the cold and snow and was dragging a garbage can out to the curb in front of her small house. Mushu ran toward her, barking deliriously. When she reached the woman, she began to hop up and down, even throwing in a complete spin. That gave Katie and Isaac at last a chance to catch up. This time, Mushu didn't run on ahead, but sat in front of the woman, wagging her tail. "I'm sorry," Katie said. "I'm not sure what's gotten into her." "Nothing to concern yourself about," the woman said. "She sounds friendly as could be." Sounds. That was when both Isaac and Katie noticed that the woman was blind. The woman set the can firmly in place by the curb, then knelt down and reached out for Mushu, who went to her, tail wagging. "Merry Christmas," Isaac said, mostly because he couldn't think of anything else to say. "Merry Christmas," the woman said. "I'm Mrs. Thornton. Pleased to meet you." Isaac eyed the walkway to her house covered in snow. Her footprints from just a minute before were already filling in. "It's snowing pretty heavily," Isaac said. "Yes," Mrs. Thornton agreed. "I'm blind, but I can still feel the snow falling on my face." Her thin lips smiled as she said this. "I'm wondering if I can help you back to the house," Isaac clarified. "I'm afraid the walkway might be slippery." "Oh, I'll be fine. Absolutely fine." "Are you alone today, on Christmas?" Isaac heard the words come out of his mouth, but was nonetheless surprised by them. He was very much a buttoned-up, keep-to-himself type of person. For the second time that day, he had found himself saying something that felt completely out of character. Mrs. Thornton gathered her winter coat around her neck as though also gathering her dignity. "There is no one here but me, but I never feel alone." "That is the best answer I can think of," Isaac said. I have a friend who's normally with me on the holidays, but she's gone right now. I was wondering if you'd be interested in coming back to my house. I don't have a car, but I would gladly escort you there and back." He glanced at Katie and decided to go all in. "I think my friend Katie here might be joining us. I have quite a lot of food, too much just for me." That was both true and not true. Thanks to Sandra, he did have plenty of food, but it was all in cans and tins and freezer containers. Beyond the last of the leftover meatloaf and a tiny bit of potato salad, he didn't actually have anything that was fully prepared. If someone had asked him at that moment, he couldn't have said why it was important to him that these two people, who were essentially strangers, would come and share a meal in his house. Isaac glanced at Katie with a slightly apologetic smile, as though he might have overstepped by indicating that she was already coming. She just laughed a little and shrugged her shoulders and said it would be nice to be around people on Christmas Day. "How far away do you live?" Mrs. Thornton asked. When Isaac told her his address, she said, "All right, I suppose that would be nice, but I'll need my cane if I'm going that far." She turned and walked sure-footedly along the walk and up the 2 steps to her front door. Mushu looked up at Isaac and Katie and barked once, softly. It felt like a benediction. 2 minutes later, Mrs. Thornton reappeared. This time, she had a knitted scarf around her neck, a pretty red hat on her head, and she was tapping a white cane in front of her. She paused in front of Isaac and said, "Do you suppose it would be all right to invite my friend Miles?" She nodded up the street. "He lives a few houses up there, 672 Crampton Lane. I know he's all alone today." "Of course," Isaac said, starting to wonder what he had gotten himself into and beginning to wonder how fast he could get some of those Sandra's meals to defrost. He regretted not having bought one of those new microwave ovens out of the Sears catalog. He reached out to Mrs. Thornton, touched her shoulder gently, then crooked his arm and offered it to her. They walked along Crampton Lane, their feet making a satisfying crunching sound on the snow as they went. Mushu led the way again, almost as though she could read the addresses on the house. This time, she stayed close, but she did stop in front of 672 Crampton Lane. "We're here," Isaac said. "Would you like me to knock on his door?" "I'll go with you," Mrs. Thornton said, and they walked up to the door arm in arm. When they reached the porch, Isaac automatically said, "Step," each time they came to one, though he had no idea if that was helpful or not. When they reached the front door, they didn't need to knock. The door swung inward, and a tall, slightly stooped man of perhaps 30 said, "Hello, Eleanor." Isaac was surprised that Miles was so young. When Mrs. Thornton, Eleanor, to her friends apparently, had mentioned him, Isaac had assumed he would be an older person. Instead, he was much younger than Isaac himself, though somewhat older than Katie. "Miles, this is Isaac. He has very kindly offered to have me over for dinner today. I thought you might like to come." Miles did not make direct eye contact with Eleanor or Isaac. Instead, he looked up over their heads and slightly to the right. He stretched his neck a bit and chewed on his lower lip. "No, I don't want to come." Miles' voice was strained, as if the very act of speaking was costly to him. Isaac immediately turned to step down. He wasn't in the business of selling strangers on the idea of coming to his house, but Eleanor was having none of it. She gripped Isaac's arm with surprising strength and out of the corner of her mouth said, "Wait, just wait." She turned back to the disheveled man who wore a sweatshirt over a collared shirt, though the tail of the shirt hung far below the hem of the sweatshirt. "Miles," she said patiently, "you're all alone. It's better to be with friends on Christmas." Miles turned his head toward her, but still didn't make eye contact. "You're my friend, Eleanor." "Of course I am, and Isaac will be too. Katie and Mushu too." Hearing her name, Mushu bounded up the stairs and reached her front paws up onto Miles' knee. She smiled up at him, wagging her tail. He immediately dropped down onto one knee. As soon as he touched her fur, he said, "Oh, oh." Mushu jumped up into his arms and licked his face. Miles' expression had been cloudy until that moment, but now the sun came out. A wide grin split his face, and he nuzzled against Mushu, who accepted the cuddle with aplomb. Miles stood and said, "Okay, I'll go. Can Joey come?" And so the afternoon, perhaps the oddest afternoon in Isaac's life, proceeded. The adventure had started with him saying hello to a young homeless woman dragging a Christmas tree down the sidewalk. By the time they reached his house again, their group had grown to 8 people and 1 small dog. Isaac, Katie, Eleanor, and Miles were joined by Joey, who wanted to know if 2 sisters named Bethany and Sylvia could come because he knew their house was often cold. Bethany and Sylvia agreed to come if they could ask their neighbor Bartholomew, who had lost his wife earlier that fall. Isaac was beginning to wonder if he had enough places for people to sit, but he knew that he had completely lost control of this whole affair. In the end, it was quite a caravan making its way down the sidewalk toward Isaac's house. Katie and Mushu led the way, with Isaac still guiding Eleanor. Miles and Joey had their heads put together talking about something, looking ever so much like Jack Sprat, who ate no fat, and his wife, who would eat no lean, since Miles was tall and thin, and Joey was short and very rotund. Bethany and Sylvia brought up the rear, one on each side of Bartholomew. Kate and Mushu stopped in front of Isaac's porch to allow him to go up first. As he led Eleanor up the stairs, his stomach tightened a little, afraid that somehow, through no fault of his own, really, he had overpromised and now he was about to underdeliver. He turned and looked out over the small congregation gathered on his lawn and said, "I'm sorry, but I don't have a traditional Christmas dinner ready for us. No turkey, no ham, no yams or mashed potatoes." The faces of those on the sidewalk below him did not change their pleasant expressions. They just nodded, waiting to see if there was more news to arrive. "I do have plenty of food, though. I just might need a little assistance. I'm not very handy in the kitchen." Eleanor leaned close and said, "If you'll open the door and we can help you figure it out. It's hard to do that standing out here." "Oh, of course," Isaac said. He pushed his front door open and was met with a reassuring whoosh of warm air. He helped Eleanor inside, then said, "Can I take your coat?" "Of course," Eleanor said, pulling it off. Underneath, she was wearing a festive Christmas sweater. Isaac couldn't have said why, but he thought that she must have changed into it when she had gone back inside her house. He hung her coat up and said, "Should I help you to the living room so you can sit down?" "You should help me to the kitchen. That's where I can do the most good." Isaac had thought that Eleanor would just sit somewhere while he figured out what to try to do and feed everyone, but that was obviously not going to be the case. "Of course," he said, leading her to the kitchen at the back of the house. "Smells clean," she said. "You're a good housekeeper, Isaac." "I am not," Isaac admitted. "I'm pretty helpless, really. I have a friend and housekeeper who does everything for me." "You are lucky to have either of those things. To have both in one person is fortunate indeed. Do you have a kitchen table?" "Yes, let me help you." Isaac led Eleanor to the table. She pulled a chair out and said, "Who else is here?" "I am," Katie said. She limped in from the hallway. "Katie is, but I'm going to take her into the bathroom and take a look at her foot. I think she needs something for it." "Good," Eleanor said, obviously and easily in charge. "Before you go, why don't you put the coffee pot on? You're not so helpless that you can't manage that, are you?" Isaac could have taken offense at that, but he didn't. He had already admitted to being helpless, after all, and Eleanor said it to him with good humor. Also, he remembered that Sandra had needed to leave him simple directions to make the coffee. He turned to Katie and said, "The bathroom's the second door on the left down the hall. I'll be right behind you and we'll look at that foot." It was obvious that Katie didn't really want to do that, but it was impossible to tell why. Was it that she didn't want to be in an enclosed space with someone she just met? Or was it possible she was concerned about how dirty or unkempt her feet were? "It's all right," Isaac said. "I was a medic in the war. No matter how bad your cut is, I swear I have seen far worse." He hoped that by putting the emphasis on her injury, he might allay her other concerns. After a few more beats, Katie nodded, smiled, and said, "Thank you," then left for the bathroom. "She is such a sweet girl," Eleanor said, while Isaac busied himself with making the coffee. Just as he plugged the pot in, the sisters came in. "We're here to help," Sylvia said, Bethany nodding her agreement beside her. They looked around and saw that nothing was underway. The oven was cold, the stovetop was empty. "You go help our friend Katie," Eleanor said. "We'll get this straightened out. Before you go, is there anything in the freezer, refrigerator, or cupboards that we shouldn't use?" Isaac thought for the briefest of moments, then shook his head. "No, please use anything you can find to put something together for everyone." "Good enough," Eleanor said. "Go on now. Help our Katie however you can." Isaac walked by the kitchen table, but Eleanor reached out and unerringly grabbed his wrist. "Thank you for doing this. It's a good thing." Isaac, still a little overwhelmed, nodded, then realized Eleanor couldn't see that. "Of course," he said. He picked up a small saucer he thought he might need and hurried to the bathroom. Behind him, he heard Eleanor taking charge. "Sylvia, you give me an inventory of the fridge. Bethany, you take the cupboards. We'll put a menu together." Isaac realized that he had forgotten his other guests, so he made a quick U-turn and hurried to the living room. He needn't have worried about that. Bartholomew was standing in front of the bookcase that held Isaac's collection of VCR tapes. Joey and Miles were standing around the card table where he had started the puzzle that morning. "You have quite a collection of movies," Bartholomew said. "Would it be all right if I pick something out?" "Of course," Isaac said. "If you'll pick it out, I'll be right back and put it in for you. The remote and everything can be a little tricky." "Do you mind if we work on your puzzle?" Miles asked. "Any pieces you find is a piece I don't have to," Isaac said, then hurried away. He knocked gently on the bathroom door, then pushed in and saw that Katie had taken off her hiking boots off both feet, along with a heavy pair of wool socks and a pair of men's dress socks. She was sitting on the edge of the tub with both feet under the faucet. She was leaning over and trying to rub the worst of the dirt off her feet. Mushu sat on the floor, watching her carefully. "I'm getting your tub dirty," she said. "That couldn't matter less," Isaac said matter-of-factly. He reached in the small closet and pulled out two thick bath towels. He laid one on the bath mat behind Katie and handed her the other one. "Let me know when you're ready for me to take a look." Katie didn't turn back towards Isaac for several long minutes. He got the idea she might be losing the will to do so. He bustled around in the medicine cabinet, getting down bandages and hydrogen peroxide and a bottle of capsules that the label said was Golden Seal. "Okay, you've got the wounds rinsed. Turn around and put your feet on the towel and let me take a look." Katie shut off the water, lifted her feet a few inches, and let the water run off them. She scooted herself around, and so she was able to put her feet on the towel. Isaac had steeled himself not to say anything no matter what he saw, but he couldn't stop himself. "Oh, honey," he said. His hand went to his mouth before he caught himself. That was all it took for the dam to burst. Katie dropped her chin to her chest and sobbed. She let loose of everything she'd been carrying with her: fear, shame, loneliness, everything. Isaac was not a touchy-feely person, but he knew what to do. He knelt beside her and held her while she cried. When he sensed a break in the storm, he sniffed, blinked, and said, "Okay, that was a good first step. Now let's get you fixed up." We're going to stop there for the second part of this. I'll read the third part and get it uploaded. Again, I hope you will give a little subscribe there at the bottom if you like the story. I think I'll write some stories just for YouTube for next year and reward you for having subscribed to my channel. So thanks a lot for watching the second part, and I will upload the third part for you to watch. Thanks.